What's up, everybody? This is the Booch, and welcome to episode 48 of the Boochcast reviews Darkside of the Ring. And once again, the Booch is riding solo as we talk about one of the greatest female wrestlers and valets of all time. This is definitely somebody I remember. And of course, we're talking about the one and only Sensational Sherri Martel. That's right. And like I said, I was very excited to watch this episode. I remember Sensational Sherri, mostly from her time in WCW. I knew a little bit about her time in WWE from watching past clips, but I only knew Sherri Martel as a valet. I actually had no knowledge whatsoever about her time as a wrestler in the business. I knew she had wrestled, but I didn't know the extent of her career. So I was very excited to learn about it in this episode. And without any further ado, we're going to get this started. Sherri Martel was a chameleon, a performer who broke new ground for women in the wrestling business, an in-ring natural that made it all look effortless. Inside the ring, outside the ring, on the microphone, and on camera, she was perfect. Whatever the gimmick, she would do whatever it needed, and everybody in the business knew that. So that was the one advantage about Sherri Martel was whatever gimmick they gave her, she tried her best to make it work and was willing to do whatever it took to get a segment over or a wrestler over or herself over or her opponent over. She was very much a team player, which is a key thing you want to be in the wrestling business, is a team player. The more of a team player you are, the more opportunities you're going to get because they know they can count on you. But few knew of the sacrifices that Sherri's total commitment to becoming a star demanded, and the high costs of her trailblazing success. She worked hard and paid the price. She was in pain, but if you don't work, you don't get paid. Now, for a lot of wrestling fans today, this is a hard concept to grasp, because every wrestler today has downside guarantee, which if you heard CM Punk's interview on Ariel Helwani a while back, he talked about how downside guarantees have hurt the wrestling business. And to an extent they have. I've also heard Al Snow talk about this, where they say that on the one hand, it helps wrestlers get paid because if you work hard, you should get paid for it. But at the same time, it doesn't really motivate the wrestlers to want to put in the work and the grind that is necessary to make it. Because that's why these wrestlers from back in the day, the legends and the icons that we love and respect, or people say they love and respect, that's how they got to where they were. Because they had to get to that level. Because if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. And depending on how much money you drew determined how high you moved up on the card. Like, their whole livelihood depended on asses in seats. There was no downside guarantee. You either worked or you didn't get paid. And anybody that's ever worked a job that got paid by the hour, or anybody like myself that works in comedy or works in music and you do it independently, a day you don't work is a day you don't get paid. So you put in the work. And that's why it's important for those kind of people. Now, people who just make money hand over fist without having to work, or people who work on salary, they don't really get that because they get their salary pay regardless of how many hours they work or whatever. There's guaranteed money coming in. So she comes from that era of if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. So even if she was in pain, she still had to get her ass up and go wrestle in that ring and wrestle through the pain. And unless you're injured, you got to go. You know, if you can get out of bed, you can go to work. That's the mentality of wrestlers. It's also the mentality of grown men in general. Now, granted, Sherri is not a man, but she was in a man's world because women's wrestling was not as prevalent back then as it is today. Now, at one point in this episode, they go to a segment where a caller was calling into like a radio show to talk to Sherri, because Sensational Sherri is being interviewed. And the caller asks, "Could you honestly tell me how much of that is fake?" Now, Sherri responds by saying, "I have a job, and I go out there and I give it everything that I got. I've run all these miles up and down the road, and I wear my body out. That's not fake. My body gets slammed on that damn canvas and on the outside of the ring. I get sent to the hospital. I get glass in my damn eyes. That's not fake." And again, this is why wrestlers, especially the old school ones, get offended by the word fake. It is offensive to wrestlers. Now, I know this is going to be an extreme comparison, but I feel like it's the only one I can make to really get people to understand why this word is bad. In the world of wrestling, the word fake It's the N-word of professional wrestling. Saying fake to a wrestler is the equivalent to saying the N-word to a black person, because it's the same result. One, you're being horribly offensive, and two, you have a high chance of getting your ass kicked. In fact, the only way you don't get your ass kicked is if you either A, work in the business, or B, you're black, obviously. Like, obviously, black people can say the N-word to each other and nobody cares. But if someone who's not black says it, they're getting their ass kicked. It's kind of the same thing. Like, people who are in the business, if they say the word fake or whatever, you know, in most cases, they don't get beat up because they're discussing it. Like, if Al Snow is using the word fake in a conversation, he's less likely to get called out by people because he's using it in a different context. So in the wrestling business, you can sort of get away with it, depending on how you deliver it. But if somebody else outside of wrestling uses the word fake, you're getting your ass kicked. Now, again, if you go to a WWE show and use it, you might get away with it because WWE is a publicly traded company. So you might get away with it there. But if you're at an indie show and you say it, you're getting your ass kicked. So proceed with caution. You know, be very careful. The word fake is a word you never want to use around wrestlers. It is highly offensive. You use scripted, you can use choreographed. Those are acceptable words. But fake, you never use. Because A, when you say wrestling is fake, you're implying it's something that anyone can do, which anybody that really watches wrestling knows it's not something everyone can do. Also, you're implying the pain that they feel isn't real when it is. Like, yes, it is scripted to some degree, and there's a way to do the moves to where it doesn't hurt as much, and there's selling involved. But when you bump on that canvas, it hurts. When you take a bump on the floor, that shit hurts. It's like DDP once said, you can't fake gravity. So that shit's gonna hurt you. There is pain involved in wrestling. And that's why you don't use the word fake. It's an insult to people who've gotten hurt and died doing wrestling. That's why they take it so personally. It's why I take it personally. It's why Gator takes it personally. Sherri was tough physically, but also mentally. She could take some of the abuses she got from the fans or from the other wrestlers, and that's why the guys liked working with her. She was all in. So she was able to take it, because when you're a heel, and Sherri was a heel for a vast majority of her career, I'd say about 90% of it, maybe 95%, you got to take the abuse because fans are going to boo. And back then, when they were protecting kayfabe, the fans legit hated Sherri. It wasn't just heel heat. It was legit anger because back then, they made you believe that that was who they were 24/7. So if you were a heel, they legit hated your guts and wanted you to die. If you were babyface, they loved you as if they knew you. So it's really, truly a mental trip that you're taking the audience on. And she had to be willing to take all that abuse. And of course, when you're dealing with wrestlers, some wrestlers, they are not the most mature bunch in the world. So if you can take the roasting and the verbal abuse from wrestlers, you eventually earn their respect. You know, she could be one of the boys, and that was helpful for Sherri. Now, here's an interesting thing I didn't know before. Sherri was the first wrestler to be managed by Jim Cornette. They got together in 1982 and both looked at each other and said, "You're greener than goose shit and I'm even worse. How can this possibly go wrong?" And they bonded from that moment because Jim Cornette was a photographer in the beginning. He took pictures of Memphis wrestling. He worked very closely with Jerry Jarrett and Christine Jarrett and the Jarrett family. They had a lot of history there. And eventually he was working his way into being a manager. But they also knew that Cornette needed practice. He needed somebody to work with. So they gave him Sherri Martel, who was also very green. So these two both are horribly inexperienced in wrestling. So they're going out there and they're flying by the seat of their pants. Jim Cornette is learning how to be a manager on the fly, and Sherri is learning how to work on the fly. So neither one of them has any experience. Sherri Martel is not sensational yet, and Jim Cornette is not the great legendary manager and controversial podcaster that we all know him to be today. They're both brand new to the business, and they're breaking in together. Now, Sherri was a diva before the divas were divas. So this is before the diva era of wrestling that we had in the Attitude Era. Outside the ring, she was a sweetheart. Now, she never met her dad, and her mom would take her to wrestling shows. She was a rebel who wanted to do something different from everybody else. And after watching wrestling, she was hooked and knew what she wanted to do. So Sherri was one of those people that watched wrestling and was a fan and knew while watching it That's what she wanted to do. Because as I mentioned before many times, whenever we watch Darkside of the Ring, there's two types of wrestlers that we see. The ones who watched wrestling and were hooked on it from the very beginning, and the people who got into wrestling because they found out they could make money at it. And then by the time they found out they weren't going to make a lot of money in the beginning, they already fell in love with it. So it's those two dynamics. So she definitely was a diehard wrestling fan and was a sweetheart outside the ring, which, as I mentioned before, some of the best heels in the business were ones that were total sweethearts outside the ring and absolute bastards and bitches in the ring. In 1974, when she was 17, she met 18-year-old Jake the Snake Roberts while he was a referee in Mid-South Wrestling. He saw her in the front row and felt an instant connection with her. They dated on again and off again for about 4 or 5 years. So, for a lot of you who don't know, Jake the Snake Roberts, when he first broke into the business, he was a referee. That's where he started. And he actually said on Joe Rogan's podcast that being a referee is the best way to start. Because when you're a referee, you see people. You know how to judge people. You know how to read people. It's a great training ground for a wrestler. So he started off as a referee before he became a wrestler. And he saw Sherri at a show, and there was a year difference between them. Although back in the 70s, I don't know what the age of consent laws were back then. But regardless, they're of age. So they dated on again and off again, which again, that's something else I didn't know. That Jake Roberts and Sensational Sherri actually dated or were in relationships or hooked up or whatever. Like, obviously, you know, time went by and they got in different relationships. I know at this time, Jake is either about to get remarried or already is to his wife, Cheryl. Cheryl he was married to and divorced, but now they're back together and they're going to get remarried. Sherri obviously moved on to other relationships, so that was just intriguing to know that they had dated before. I had no idea. That was, again, that's another thing I love about Darkside of the Ring is I get to learn something new that I didn't know before, and it adds to my already great wrestling mind. Now, in those days, there were no training programs that were advertised. You just had to hang around until somebody was willing to take a chance on you if you wanted to be involved in wrestling. So there weren't a lot of advertised wrestling schools. You had to just kind of go to shows and meet people or find somebody that was willing to train you and give you the time of day. And, you know, they were hard to find. So she goes to meet Grizzly Smith, who was a road agent and matchmaker for Mid-South Wrestling, when she's 16. So she's 16 years old, meeting Grizzly Smith. That can't be good. And tells him she wants to be a wrestler. He tells her to come back when she's 21. So basically saying, you're too young to be a wrestler. Dreaming of being a wrestling star, but with no avenue to begin her training, by 1976, Sherri is living and working in New Orleans. While at a restaurant, she meets Leroy Gonzalez. He was in training at the restaurant, and she called him over to complain about a roach in the booth. Leroy jokingly says, "I wish I'd be that roach." Sherri laughs and invites him to meet her across the street for a drink where she worked. Leroy goes over and realizes he's in a strip club. Now, Sherri was a dancer there. After her set, she chats him up at the bar and they have an instant connection. She tells him she wants to stop stripping. Leroy buys a trailer and she moves in with him. Later, he proposes to her and she says yes. Because obviously, stripping is not what Sherri wants to do for the rest of her life. She wants to be a wrestler. But she also has to make money. And when you're broke and you need money, you do what you got to do sometimes. And for her, this was the best way for her to make money. And people say whatever they want about strippers, but they make good money. They do, especially the tips. Like, strippers definitely make good money. So it is a place to make money if you absolutely need it. But obviously, it should not be your primary job of choice. But it's what you gotta do to pay the bills, do it. But obviously she wants to stop. So Leroy says, come move in with me. And now they're living in a trailer. Now Sherri would still go out and party with her friends. They would do marijuana, uppers, mollies, downers, quaaludes, and cocaine. They got in constant fights about it, but she wouldn't stop. Eventually, she wanted to have a family. In July of 1978, they have their child. Leroy tells her, now you have to grow up and take care of the child. She decides to leave him and pursue her career of becoming a wrestler. And he laughs at her, he doesn't take her seriously. The baby was 3 months old. Now, this is the part of the show where I'm gonna say, fuck this bitch. And I'm gonna tell you why. Because the hypocrisy of this is what makes me so goddamn angry. Now, obviously, I don't know Sherri Martel. I never met her. I didn't know Leroy. I didn't know her son. I have no personal connection to any of this. But what makes me so goddamn angry is when someone put this episode up on YouTube and I saw in the comments section the hypocrisy of people cheering her on for chasing her dream. Like, if you're a woman who leaves your family because you want to have a career, most women, especially hardcore feminists, will praise the shit out of you. Like, go get him, queen, go slay it, go get a job. You can do anything men can do. Don't let anybody hold you down. They will do that shit. But if a man did the same thing, which has happened, there are men who have left their families to go pursue shit. But when they do it, everyone says, loser, deadbeat, you ran away from your responsibilities, you're a coward, you won't take care of your family. It's like, it's okay for one person, but not the other. That's the hypocrisy that makes me so goddamn angry. Like, look, if she wanted to be a pro wrestler, she should be allowed to pursue that dream. But to leave your family completely is fucked up, especially when your husband's telling you you gotta grow up and take care of a child. There's nothing wrong with what Leroy says there, because when you do have a kid, you do have to grow up to a degree. Now, that doesn't mean you can't pursue your dreams or your goals. I'm not one of those people that thinks a baby should prevent you from achieving your goals in life. A baby should not hold you back. But you still got to raise that kid while you're pursuing your dream. You got to find a way to balance the two. That's the honest answer there. You got to find a way to balance it out. Or don't have a kid. And that's the thing that really bothers me is everyone's obsessed with, I want to have a family. I want to have a family. But then you want a career that prevents you from taking care of a family. Because being a wrestler, you're on the road all the time. Being a comedian, you're on the road all the time. Musician, you're on the road all the time. But at the same time, they're like, I want to have a family. Okay, if you can't balance the two, then you got to drop one. Either you want to be an entertainer or you want to have a family. Because think about it. Every biopic you've ever seen of an entertainer, wrestler, comedian, musician, whatever, they all have the same thing. The guy, usually the guy, ends up being married like what, 2 or 3 times? Because of the sacrifices they have to make. And they have the kids that grow up, they're not there. And then they end up trying to reconnect with them later, or they don't reconnect with them at all. They just decide want nothing to do with you. And then you have to get remarried to the second family. And then there, he raises that family and lives their life and travels. But because by that point, he's already rich and famous. So now he has the money and he's done so much in his career, he can slow it down and take care of that family. That's why it happens. It's hard to balance both. I'm not saying it's not doable, but it's tough. If she really wanted to be a professional wrestler, she should have never said, I want to have a family. Because I'm going to be straight up honest. I do entertainment. I'm a comedian. I do videos. I do freelance stuff. I work around the clock. So having a family is the last thing on my mind. Now, that's not to say if I found the right person, I wouldn't want to do that. But I know at this stage of my life, I am nowhere near ready for that shit. I know I'm not. And it's selfish and wrong of me to tell somebody I want to have a family when I know I'm not ready for it. Or for someone to pressure me to have a family when they know I'm not ready for it. I'm telling them I'm not ready for it. But everybody uses the excuse of, well, you're not getting younger. Who gives a fuck? You shouldn't have a family just because society dictates you have to have kids. No, you don't. You got to ask yourself before you get married and have kids, do you want that life? Because if you do, they do become a responsibility. Now again, I'm not saying you can't pursue your dreams, but you got to find a balance. And if you're incapable of balancing it, don't start that family. Because you're just going to end up hurting that family, which inevitably is what Sherri ends up doing. More on that later. Sherri moves to Memphis, where she again finds work as an exotic dancer, while continuing her search for a way to break into the wrestling business. She goes to a school run by Butch Moore. She tells him she wants to be a wrestler. He gets up and slaps her hard across the face. She looked at him and said, "Is that all you got?" He was impressed and offered to train her. Now, that right there sounds harsh as fuck. But back then, you had to be tough to be in the business. So, in Butch's mind, he's thinking, if she starts crying and runs out of there, well then, I'm not wasting my time. But when she said, that's it, that's what you get. Because here's the thing. Back then, when you trained somebody for the wrestling business, you were responsible for their success or failure. Like if you put your stamp on somebody and said, I trained this person, I taught them everything they know, and they go out there and fuck shit up, it makes you look bad. Because, wait, you taught her to be this shitty? That's why it's very difficult to put your name on somebody. You know, that's why you really got to think before you give somebody a recommendation for anything. Like if you got a friend that's looking for a job and they want to put you down as a reference, or if you work at a job and a friend saying, hey, can you get me a job here? Before you do that, ask yourself this question. Do you want your name attached to this person? Because if you help your friend get a job and they go in there and fuck shit up, they're going to look at you. Why did you make me hire this guy or girl? They suck. I'm not trusting your judgment anymore. So that's a very serious thing you got to take. Like when I left Home Depot and went to Lowe's, my friend Kristen was the one who got me the job at Lowe's. She was willing to put her stamp of approval on me because she knew, even though I had a very short fuse and I don't take shit from anybody, I'm still a hard worker. And she knew my hard work would overrule my temper because it only came out of me when people disrespected me. So she put her stamp of approval on me and it worked because I did a damn good job at Lowe's until I left. So it reflected good on her because she recommended me. And that was another motivation for me to do well, is because I wanted Kristen to look good. Because she and I have been friends for a very long time, still friends today. We don't talk as often as we used to because our lives are going separate directions, but we're still friends. If she texted me or called me today or tomorrow, I'd happily sit on the phone with her. So that's a cool thing. Now, obviously, she goes right back to stripping because she's got to make her money while trying to break into the business. And Butch Moore is now the one training her. Now, a year later, she goes to Grizzly and tells him she has a year's worth of wrestling training under her belt, throws her driver's license at him and says, I'm 21 now, I'm ready, I have a son, I'm divorced. This is what I want to do. Grizzly looks at her and says, why? She says, because I think I can be the best person that I possibly can be. This is the career I want. He says, okay. So after training for 1 year and turning 21, she finally goes to Grizzly and is able to work under Grizzly Smith in Mid-South. And she's ready to continue her training and continue to work and continue to build her resume. And she's making it clear she's got a son and she's divorced. Because obviously her and Leroy were clearly divorced by this point because she left him and the kid and hasn't been home since. From time to time, Sherri would stay at Grizzly's house and she became friends with his daughter, Rockin' Robin. Robin later beat Sherri for the WWE Women's title. Also, because she was 21, Sherri never had to worry about Grizzly because she was too old for his liking. So, because Grizzly was into much younger girls, Sherri never had to worry about Grizzly hitting on her. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into full detail about that, but if you want to learn more about Grizzly Smith and his behavior, go check out the Grizzly Smith episode of Darkside of the Ring that I did with Zach and Desmond. Because we go into the full detail about Grizzly Smith and his life and his history, as well as Rockin' Robin, Sam Houston, Jake the Snake. We talk more about the Smith family in that episode. Although I should warn you, it is the most intense episode of them all. I guarantee you, no matter how crazy these other episodes of Darkside of the Ring have been, none are more intense than that. And we tell some stories in that motherfucker. Go check out the Grizzly Smith Dark Side of the Ring episode that we have here on Boochcast Reviews Dark Side of the Ring. It's in the playlist, so you can go down the playlist and check it out there. Now, she learns the basics working in Mid-South and also developed a reputation for being a little stiff in the ring, like laying them in there. Like she really goes after it with her opponents. She's not potatoing them, she's a little stiff. It's not too hard, but hard enough to make a point. Now, eventually, Grizzly sends Sherri over to the Fabulous Moolah to continue her career. Because Moolah booked all of the women in the wrestling territories, so to make it as a woman in the business, it helped to be trained by her and be part of her troupe. Now, if you want to learn more about Fabulous Moolah and her troupe and how she trained and the way she basically ran shit, you can also check out the Fabulous Moolah episode of Dark Side of the Ring that I did a real while back. So check out the Moolah page if you want to learn more about the Fabulous Moolah and her history. Now, Moolah basically ran a military school for women wrestlers. She had strict curfews and the women had to be back at the compound at a certain time. And she said that Sherri was into that night clubbing, and darling, that was just too much for me. That was her attitude. As a result, she was asked to leave the compound because she would break curfew all the time. After that, she was able to use her own personality to get over instead of being told what to do by Moolah. Because Moolah basically gave you your gimmick, gave you your character, told you exactly what you were going to do, kind of like a Vince McMahon kind of thing. So once she was able to break away from the Fabulous Moolah, she was able to develop her own persona. In the months after Sherri leaves her husband and infant son behind to pursue wrestling, Leroy struggles to put their family back together. Leroy hired a private investigator to find her because he wanted her to come back home. One night while making a deposit at a bank ATM, 3 big guys walked up to him and said, "Leave Sherri alone. She belongs to us now." He never tried to contact her again. Now, this right here is fucked up as hell. Because, first of all, I don't give a fuck how big you are. If my wife leaves me and I want to find her, I'm gonna fucking find her. Because at that point, it's like, look, you better fucking kill me if you say some shit like that. Now, obviously, in this situation, there's 3 guys, so he's probably backing down because it's a 3-on-1 fight that he's probably not gonna win. But I'm telling you right now, after that day, not only would I continue to find my wife, at that point, I'm buying a fucking gun. And if I saw those 3 guys again, them motherfuckers getting shot. Because I ain't playing that shit. But I guess he decided it was no longer worth his time and left her alone. Now, I'm the type of person where if you want to leave me, leave. I'm fine with that. And the fact that she didn't take the kid with her would have also helped. Because I'm telling you right now, I'm one of those people like, you're not just going to leave me and take my kid. Then we fight at that point. But if we have a child and the woman decides to just leave me and it's just me and the kid, all right, that's fine. I can go find another woman to help me raise my kid that wants to be a real mom if she don't want the fucking job. But yeah, that was 50 Shades of fucked up right there. After stints in Japan and Mid-South Wrestling, by the mid-1980s, Sherri Martel is working as a wrestler and manager in the AWA, a regional promotion based in Minneapolis. Vern Gagne, the promoter, had no connection to the Fabulous Moolah, so he could book anybody he wanted to book, and it showed that Sherri earned her spot on the roster. So it wasn't like the Fabulous Moolah was using nepotism to get Sherri Martel booked in the AWA. No, she earned her spot there. She impressed Vern Gagne to where she could get a spot. Now, the AWA had a small female roster, but the women they did use were very accomplished. Sherri was physical and could dish out a lot of punishment. Also, her psychology was on point and her timing was incredible. So, by this point, Sherri Martel is skilled in the ring. Her training paid off. She's become a master of psychology and a master of timing in the ring, which are 2 important things you need in order to be well as a wrestler. You gotta know psychology so you can work the crowd, and you gotta have good timing so everything looks believable. So she has that ability. And again, the AWA has a small female roster, and that's because most wrestling companies and territories didn't use women wrestlers. But when they did use women wrestlers, they were women that were good. You could not be a woman who sucked in the ring and or on the mic and get a job in wrestling. In order to be on their roster, you had to be incredible. So when they did show women's wrestling, it was worth watching, because it was a bonus on the card. It was like icing on the cake. You know, hey, here's some ladies action. They weren't going to use just any random woman. If you wanted to be on the AWA roster, if you wanted to be on the big time, you had to be great. Now, for the men, they had varying degrees. But for women, you had to be accomplished. You had to be on point, on task, on message. You had to know what the fuck you were doing. So you didn't go out there and stink up the joint. Because again, women's wrestling was not taken very seriously. So as a woman, you had to take the business seriously for them to even look at you. And with some of the women wrestlers I've seen in the business today, there's a part of me that wishes that mindset was still there. Because, again, in women's wrestling, there's a lot of women who are very, very good. But there's also a fuck ton who are the drizzling shits. But because we live in a PC libtard society, all those women get TV time, which is not good. Having a child in wrestling was frowned upon for women. So Sherri put her son out of sight and out of mind while pursuing her career, which, that's fucked up. I don't understand why having a child is frowned upon for women. I think that's stupid. And again, I hate the stigma that a woman cannot have a child and a career. I believe you can do both. Again, if you can balance the 2. It's doable. I've seen women who've had careers and also had children. Now, granted, their career is not as successful or extravagant as the woman who doesn't have kids, but they still have careers. Now, again, because you have a child, it's going to hinder you a little bit. So what's going to happen? but it can be done. The thing is, you got to stop assuming that you're going to be at the same level as someone who doesn't have kids. They're always going to be a few steps ahead of you if you're a good mother. You can still get to the top. It's just going to take you a little bit longer. But if you're willing to put in the work and willing to be a good mom, you can do it. So I do think it's fucked up that Sherri's just not thinking about her child at all while pursuing a career. I do think that's wrong. Now, her son's name was Jared Gonzalez, and he makes an appearance in this episode. Now, he talks funny. So that's a warning when you watch this. He has a very funny voice, a weird voice. But that's because he lost part of his tongue due to cancer. Now, he asks us not to judge Sherri for what she did because he was always taken care of and she made sure of it. He also has a stepmom named Pat who raised him. Jared found out his mom was Sherri at 3 years old. So he's 3 years old when he discovers that Sensational Sherri is his mom. Now, eventually, Leroy gets remarried to a woman named Pat. And she becomes his stepmom and the woman who raised him. And he's able to have a regular, stable family. But he says he was always taken care of. So apparently, Sherri found some way, I guess financially, she sent some money back home to make sure he was taken care of. Now, despite all the stuff that I've said previously in this video, and I stand by it, once I saw this part where he said, don't judge his mom, my opinion of Sherri went back up a little bit. Because this is how I look at it. Even though I think it's fucked up what she did, if Jared's not going to be upset with her, then why would I still be upset with her? You know what I mean? That's how I look at it. Jared is the one who has the right, he has every right to say, fuck this bitch. But if he's not going to kill her, what am I going to kill her for? Now, obviously, when I say kill her, I mean metaphorically, like verbally, like eviscerate verbally. You know, if he's not going to hate on her, there's no reason for any of us to. If he can forgive her, we can all forgive. Now, they started making arrangements for him to fly out and spend time with her for a week. She wound up sending him back 2 days later. Jared is still angry about not getting to spend more time with his mom. So he's mad about that in that aspect. And I also agree that's fucked up. If you're a parent that's away from your kid and you make arrangements to spend time with that kid for a period of time, like a week, you should commit to that week. Obviously, you still got to work and everything, but you should still commit to that week. Even if you got to leave the kid in the locker room or get somebody to watch, which I've seen or heard stories of wrestlers doing. Hey, I'm going to hang out with some wrestlers over here. They go out to the ring, come back. You find somebody you can trust in the locker room. Simple as that. Don't make the commitment if you can't follow through with it. Even if something comes up, find a way to make it work. If you agree to have somebody meet with you for a week, you should spend time with that kid for a week. That kid should not be denied time with a parent. And I would say that if it's a mom or a dad, make the effort. Now, you might not be a parent that can make the effort every day or every week or even every month for that matter. There might go long periods of time. But when you finally make the time, commit to it. It's one thing to not have the time. It's another thing to make the time and then flake out on it. That's even worse to me. Now, the women were trying to push the envelope to show that they should be taken seriously. Jesse Ventura and Curt Hennig both took her seriously. And when they left to go to WWE, they put in a good word for her with Vince, and he decides to bring her in. Because at this point, there's a lot of people leaving the AWA to go to WWE. Because Hulk Hogan had left to bring in the Hulkamania era. Dr. D. David Schultz, who we talked about in the Slap Heard Around the World, he goes up there. Mean Gene Okerlund, he goes up there. And Jesse's right behind them. And then Curt Hennig follows. So now they're bringing in Sherri because Vern wasn't able to keep his talent because Vince was able to offer them more money. And Vern was paying them less money from what Jesse Ventura said. Their money was going down. So when Vince is offering them more, they're going to jump at the more money because it's the wrestling business. It's a business decision. Now, granted, the promoter, Vern Gagne, he's going to take it personally because all promoters take shit personally. Very few are able to separate the business from the personal. It's all personal to them. Now, as soon as Sherri arrives in the WWE, she is pitted against her former mentor, the Fabulous Moolah. At the time, Moolah had been the women's champion for 28 years. And she was in her mid-50s. Vince was ready for a title change and paid Moolah enough money to where she would be willing to drop the strap. She did, and Sherri became the new women's champion. Now, this part here, I'm going to be brutally honest, I'm confused as fuck about this. And I'm going to tell you why. Simply because I was under the impression that Wendy Richter was the one who ended the Fabulous Moolah's 28-year run as the champion. That was the impression that I got. I don't remember Sensational Sherri being the one to dethrone the Fabulous Moolah and end that 28-year run as the champion. So that confused me. And I'm trying to do research on it right now, and I'm not really finding anything that helps me figure that out. Because according to this, it says that in 1984, on the Brawl to End It All, was when she defeated Moolah for the championship, according to this. So I'm confused. How did Sherri end the reign when it says here that Richter did it in 84? So that's the part that I'm finding really weird. And it was the largest ratings for MTV. It was also the beginning of the Rock and Wrestling Connection. She later faced Lena Kai, who defeated Richter for the title. She regained the title at the first WrestleMania 1 month later. And then she defended the title in Madison Square Garden. She lost to the Spider, who turned out to be the Fabulous Moolah in disguise. So in 85, she won the title back. And the plan was concocted by Vince McMahon, who brought in Moolah after Richter refused to sign a new contract, but she claimed she's under her original 5-year contract. And then she also claimed that she was becoming more popular than the men, and that's why they did it, or whatever the fuck. But apparently in 85, she won the belt back, and then in 1987, she drops the belt. So that's why I find this whole thing fucking confusing. Like, this doesn't make any fucking sense. Technically, Wendy Richter was the one who ended it, unless they wanted to just erase that from history. So that's some historically inaccurate shit over here. And I want to point that out, that that's not accurate. That kind of confused the shit out of me when I saw that. Now, eventually Rockin' Robin gets signed, and they're on the road with Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Jake the Snake Roberts 7 days a week, every week. The women worked hard every single night, but Sherri worked harder than she needed to. So Sherri would overdo it because, again, she's trying to prove she's one of the boys. But she's doing it at her expense because she already has the respect of the locker room. So she doesn't have to kill herself. She still has to work hard. She still has to put on great matches, but she's no longer at a point where she has to kill herself to impress the guys. I mean, for Christ's sake, Jesse Ventura and Kurt Hennig got her a job. They already know you can work. Now is the time to protect your body so you can get some longevity out of your career. Now, Jerry would watch her on TV and be excited to see his mom wrestling. Leroy hated wrestling because it broke up the family. So even though Jared has a love for pro wrestling, Leroy hates the business. And guess what? I don't fucking blame him. I don't blame Leroy at all. Not one bit. He has every right to hate the wrestling business. Hell, there was a phase I went through where I hated the wrestling business. But mostly it was because of the shit I went through in the business. Now, eventually I was able to find some love for it again, but it took a while. Hopefully someday Leroy can find that too. And I do applaud him, despite his hatred for the business, agreeing to be part of this interview. I'm sure they paid him real well for it. Now, wrestling consumed Sherri's life, and it left her emotionally wrecked because of the fact that she was away from her son. But she just kept her nose to the ground and kept grinding. She never opened up to anyone about how she was feeling. So she kind of kept that shit to herself and just kept working and grinding and staying focused. Which unfortunately is what you have to do to succeed in a business like this. You got to face forward and keep grinding. But obviously being away from her son was hurting her emotionally. And that can fuck anybody up. So at least she's having remorse. And at least she doesn't hate her son. I can give her credit for that. Now, back then, the female wrestlers were an attraction. They were a special thing to put on the card. So if any of the female wrestlers wanted to be taken seriously, they had to be accepted in the locker room. And the guys would have greater appreciation for their work in the ring. Again, it was just an attraction. It wasn't meant to be anything major. It's just a special thing you have. Like, hey, we have all these great matches, and as a bonus, here's some women wrestling. But again, they only wanted the best. You couldn't be mediocre like a lot of the women you see today. You couldn't suck out loud like a lot of the women you see today. You had to actually be great. You had to be a Rhea Ripley, Becky Lynch, Bianca Belair, Jade Cargill level great. That's the level you need to be at. A Trish Stratus, a Lita, that kind of shit. Those women, Jacqueline, Ivory level, those bitches. You had to be like them to get a spot on a card, okay? You couldn't be a Chris Statlander. You couldn't be a Mid Morgan. And you sure as hell couldn't be a Roxanne Perez. You had to be way better than that. Way better. Everybody liked Sherri because she was one of the boys. Back then, that was considered a huge compliment if you were a woman because the guys accepted you as being a tough partier that's stiff in the ring. She could drink or snort most of the guys under the table. Whatever she did to the max. She loved coke, weed, and booze. She would go on benders but never missed a match. One night in the ring, they were at a state fair, and Sherri was so fucked up, she accidentally kicked Robin in the throat, and she couldn't breathe. Eventually, she was able to breathe again, and when they got back to the dressing room, Sherri grabs Robin and gives her a big hug. She felt bad about what she did and apologized. Now, obviously, kudos to Sherri for apologizing. She did the right thing. Now, obviously, Robin accepted the apology, at least based on what I heard in the interview. That was the vibe that I got. But at that moment, that should be a wake-up call like, hey, now it's affecting your performance. And that's the problem with being a partier. It's one thing to party outside the ring. It's another thing to party to the point that in the ring, you're fucked up. You should never be fucked up in the ring. You want to party before the show or after the show, that's up to you. But under no circumstances should you ever be in a condition not to perform, especially back then. Like what we talked before in the Buff Bagwell video, how Buff used to time his highs. Like he would be high and drunk back in the day, and _ back in the day, underline that. They would get drunk and high before the show. They would be sober at the show, and then once the show was completely over and the fans were gone, then they would get back on the booze and the pills. Sherri is on all that shit in the ring. That's not good. By 1990, Sherri Martel is a dominant force in the WWE as one of its premier female wrestlers, but that is about to change. Vince back then wasn't sold on having an entire women's division and was ready to wrap it up. But he likes Sherri, so he decides to make her a valet for her top male wrestlers and make her more money than she's ever made. Being a valet in the main event scene paid more than wrestling on the bottom of the card, especially in WWE. So Vince back then didn't want a women's division. So that's why the women's title was, for a long time, a title that came and went. It would have a run and then it would be defunct because Vince didn't really want a women's division. He didn't care. It meant nothing to him. Now, eventually, in WWE, that would change with the Divas division and the Attitude Era and the women's era that would come up later on in the 2010s and the women's division we see in WWE today as well as AEW and other places. But back then, Vince didn't care enough. And again, even though Sherri was being a valet, she was making more money, which again, wrestlers back then would take the money. She didn't need to wrestle on the bottom of the card because she had nothing to prove as a wrestler. She didn't have to go out there and do tackle, drop down, leapfrog, because that's the difference, again, between wrestlers who are professionals and wrestlers who are marks. The marks are the ones who have to go out there and take the unnecessary bumps and go out there and get thrown around the ring for little to no money. For my art. That bullshit. The ones who are actually in the business are like, well, I can make this amount of money and not take bumps. Fuck yeah, I'll take this. Now, during her time in WWE, she managed Ted DiBiase, the Macho King Randy Savage, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, and Tatanka, Buffalo. She would figure out a way to tweak her personality and her appearance and the way she dressed and the way she acted to kind of more closely fit the guys she was with while still being at the root of it herself. And that was her gift. She tweaked her personality to fit the wrestlers she was managing. She didn't try to stand out on her own. So when she was Ted DiBiase, she dressed more sophisticated. When she was with the Macho King, she was Queen Sherri. She dressed like a queen. When she was with Shawn Michaels, she's just a little more provocative. When she was with Tatanka, Buffalo, she would dress more Native American. Jarrett eventually got to go on the road with her mom from time to time and meet wrestlers and celebrities. So eventually, he's spending time with his mom. And I think it's once she got to WWE and she wasn't taking as many bumps and was able to focus more on her son now that she's got money like that, now Jarrett can actually spend time with his mom. Because again, she's making the money now. So she's now in a position where she can balance mother and career, which is easy to do when you got money. Sherri was the first valet to be a trained wrestler, which again is something I didn't know. I didn't know that. I know there's a lot of valets in wrestling, but I didn't know that Sherri was the first one to actually be trained in wrestling. I found that intriguing. She wasn't afraid to get in there and mix it up and do what needed to be done in the finish to get the people on the edge of their seat. She didn't care if she was wearing a $5,000 ball gown. She's going to be down on the floor, choking the guy that her wrestler is opposing. She also wasn't afraid to take bumps, and she took many crazy, painful bumps. And because the female frame is not as big as a man's, it took a greater toll on her body. And of course, this is the part of the show where the feminists and the leftist libtards are going to get offended because we talk about female frame and a male frame. That's the argument people use for why women should not be competing in men's sports or men should not be competing in women's sports and get the trannies out of there because of body structure and frames. That's why Fallon Fox should not be allowed to wrestle in the women's division of the UFC. Because you got a man identifying as a woman fracturing women's skulls in the octagon because the frame is different. A female frame is not as big as a man's frame. So it takes a greater toll on your body. And that's not sexist. That's science and biology. Science. The thing that liberals like to use whenever they talk about global warming or climate change. But yet when it comes to human biology, you'll throw it out the fucking window to protect people's feelings. She took a lot of somas to fight the pain. Jarrett said he never saw his mom sober and never told his father about it because he was afraid he wouldn't let him spend time with her anymore. So Jarrett knew she was on the shit, but wanted to spend time with his mom. So I get why he never told his dad. And I don't blame him, because Jarrett wants to spend time with his mom, and despite the fact that she's on the somas and high all the time, she's not being a bad mother. It's not like her on somas is hurting Jarrett. She's not neglecting him. She's not being abusive. Nothing bad has happened to Jarrett while his mom was on the somas. So there would be no reason for the father to be worried or concerned. Now, after the steroid scandal, the WWE implements a drug testing policy for illegal substances. Sherri fails a number of times for marijuana. She gets called into Vince McMahon's office where she sees him, Bruce Pritchard, and J.J. Dillon. They tell her she has failed another drug test and that she is being fired. Back then, that's how they dealt with it, even in the territory days. If you showed up intoxicated, you got fired. There was no rehab option. So during this time, WWE was not paying for people to go to rehab like they would do in the 2000s. Mid-2000s, where they would send certain people to rehab and pay for it to help them get sober again. They had ways of doing that to help wrestlers. Back then, they just fired you. And obviously, this is after the steroid scandal, which, for those of you who don't follow that, again, we have a Boochcast Reviews episode where we talk about the steroid trials, myself and Gator Ricky Ross. So go check that episode out as well. It's in the Darkside of the Ring playlist, so make sure you go check that out. And that's, of course, assuming you're watching this and you're not going through the playlist, but you can check it out there. Now, obviously, marijuana today sounds like a stupid thing to get in trouble for, especially since in the present day, WWE has banned marijuana from their drug testing. So you can smoke pot and it doesn't count towards you getting in trouble. But back then it did, because marijuana was still heavily frowned upon and was still seen as a terrible drug, even though nowadays we know it's not. Fired from the WWE in 1993, Sherri Martel needs to figure out her next move to stay working in the industry that she loves. She goes home, makes some phone calls, and eventually gets booked by Smoky Mountain Wrestling. She did a great job, but one night after one of the shows, Cornette noticed she was having a cruise on Lake Havasoma. Now, obviously, Smoky Mountain Wrestling was run by Jim Cornette, and since he and Sherri came up in the business together, naturally, he would give her a job. It makes perfect sense. Now, if you're heavily somaed, not only are you zombified mentally, but your whole body's out of control. She had horrible back pain. That's why she took the somas. The problem is she took too much. She thought it made her perform better, but it actually made her worse. So that's the key thing that people make clear in this episode, that yes, Sherri took a lot of somas, but she wasn't doing them to get high. She was doing them to fight the horrible back pain. It wasn't like she's making up a story to get somas to get high. She legit, for a shoot, had back problems. And she was taking the somas to fight it. And again, as someone who worked closely with Buff Bagwell while he was on somas, That is 100% true. You are definitely zombified mentally. Now, again, I didn't know this because I had very little to no knowledge how somas worked. So it wasn't until Buff got sober and I got to see him completely clean and sober that I realized how fucked up he really was on the somas. Because for me to say Buff was fucked up, he had to be really, really, really fucked up. Most of the time I thought he was just tired. But there were a few times where he was really, really out of it. And I could tell, okay, something ain't right here. But again, that comes with experience. I wasn't around enough people who took somas to be able to tell the difference. Apparently, other people were. Despite her ongoing issue with pain medication, Sherri returns to the spotlight with WWE rival World Championship Wrestling. She was hired because she was a great talent and got to manage Harlem Heat and Ric Flair. She gave credibility to Harlem Heat because at the time, nobody really knew who they were, but everyone knew who she was. So that's the key thing there. She brought name and recognition to Harlem Heat during a time when nobody knew who they were. Now, obviously today, we all know about Harlem Heat, Booker T and Stevie Ray, Hall of Famers, and hands down, one of the greatest tag teams of all time, truly. And I loved when they were part of Harlem Heat. I remember when there was a controversial moment where Booker T and Stevie Ray would walk to the ring like with a collar and leash, and it looked offensive because you had black men in chains. People found that offensive. It got even more offensive when they were also aligned with Colonel Robert Parker, who was also a manager for Harlem Heat, and Parker and Sherri had a little bit of a relationship going kayfabe-wise until they eventually split up. And of course, she joined with Ric Flair right around the time Hogan was coming into WCW, and Hogan and Flair were having their feud. And that's when Hogan and Sherri would definitely mix it up in the ring. And they weren't afraid to go at it. Although sometimes Hogan would stop himself because Flair would use Sherri as a shield to block off Hogan, because Hogan's a babyface, he couldn't punch her. But eventually, when it got to the point where Sherri was crossing the line, getting physical, Hogan would retaliate and the crowd would pop. Because Sherri was so good at getting heat. Sherri's passion and dedication to career comes at the cost of never having enough time for her son, Jared. Many times she begged him for forgiveness, and Jared said, "You don't have to beg." And that's how much of a stand-up guy Jared is. Again, this is a guy who has completely forgiven his mom for everything. This is the one person who has every right to hate her guts and chooses not to. So I commend Jared. Jared, I tip my hat to you, sir. You are a lot better than most other men. There are a lot of people who never forgave their parents for things. And I commend you for finding the strength to do so. Now, eventually, Sherri reached a point where she couldn't perform the way she used to, and she was again showing up under the influence, and it was affecting her ability to perform in the ring. Which, again, is a problem, because you can be the most talented person in the world, and there's a lot of shit promoters will put up with if you draw money. But the moment your performance in the ring goes down, and the fans are no longer getting their money's worth, you are now getting to a point where you can be. As her wrestling career nears its end, Sherri Martel marries her new boyfriend, Robert Schroll. Sherri was struggling to live a normal life because she didn't do normal well. According to Jared, Robert was driving a wedge between Sherri and the family and taking her away from them. So apparently this Robert guy was toxic, and Sherri's trying to live a normal life, but Robert wants the spotlight life because you marry a celebrity, you want all the perks of being married to a celebrity. Even though this particular celebrity, her stock is going down a little bit and she's not as famous as she used to be. The last time Jared saw his mom was when she was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006 after several years away from the wrestling business. She was the second woman to ever get inducted. She loved the honor, but hated the moment because she knew it was all over. So, as much as she loved being done to the Hall of Fame, she also knew her career was over at that point. She's in the Hall of Fame. She's not going to wrestle anymore. She's not going to manage anymore. She's pretty much done. But she still enjoyed her time in the business. And from what I can gather, actually, her last time appearing in a ring was obviously in September 2006 when she managed Bobby Roode in TNA. That was actually her last time in the ring. And she was inducted by the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, and gave a really great speech. And she was in the same induction class as Bret the Hitman Hart, Eddie Guerrero, Mean Gene Okerlund, Vern Gagne, Tony Atlas, the Blackjacks, and William Perry, the Refrigerator Perry. So that's her graduating class. And obviously, Sensational Sherri 100% deserved the Hall of Fame. And in case you're wondering, Fabulous Moolah was the first woman to go into the Hall of Fame. So Sherri was number 2. And obviously since then, there's been a lot of women that follow because WWE now has a policy with the Hall of Fame where they induct at least one female into the Hall of Fame every year. So that's now a thing. But Sherri definitely deserved the Hall of Fame. From her wrestling, the valet, the impact she had on the business. And I'm glad she was alive to give her speech and have a great time. Although it seems her career may be over, Sherri spends the next year optimistic for her future in the business. She had told her friend that WWE was going to bring her back. They would pay her back surgery and have her train the women. So basically, they were going to pay money to have her get back surgery because her back had been bothering her for most of her life. And then she was going to become a trainer. They were going to have her at their developmental territory and helping to bring up the future of wrestling. Now, on June 15, 2007, in McCalla, Alabama, Sherri Martel dies at her mother's residence. Sherri's sudden death at age 49 causes local Alabama police to open an investigation. She had collapsed in a rocking chair on the porch. Following a brief investigation, Sherri Martel's death is ruled an accidental overdose. Her system had alprazolam, carisoprodol, whatever the fuck that is, mepropamate, dihydrocodone, hydrocodone, and oxycodone. So that's what she was on at the time of her death. Now, obviously I know what some of these are. The other ones I don't have a fucking clue. Regrettably, the addiction struggles that plagued Sherri's life are also on display at the funeral. Many people were coked out of their minds, including Jake Roberts, who was leaning over the casket and completely out of it. Because keep in mind, Jake wasn't sober yet at this time, because this is 2007. Jake wouldn't get sober until about 2012. Harlem Heat also attended the funeral, but weren't fucked up. So Harlem Heat wasn't on anything. Jake felt hurt and betrayed by her death because he cared so much about her. Because like I said, they dated on and off for 4 or 5 years. Obviously, there was some love and connection there. And even when the relationship ended, they were still really good friends. So obviously, Jake still cared about her on some level. Because when you really love somebody, even when the relationship's over, you still feel something for that person. There are some people you just never stop loving. You might fall out of love with them from a relationship standpoint, but if you really got along with somebody, there's a part of you that still cares about them. And that's never going to go away. And no one should feel insecure about that. If you're dating somebody and they have an ex who dies and they're a little emotional about it, you shouldn't judge a person for that. Because, like I said, there's always a part of you that's going to love somebody that you dated. Unless the relationship ended really badly and was really toxic, in which case you're not going to feel as bad. But if the relationship just ended and you still cared about that person, it's going to hit you. Like, there's some exes that I have that if they died, I was going to feel something. I had an ex who died in 2018, and that affected me. And I have some exes that if, God forbid, they died tomorrow, I would feel hurt a little bit. There would be some pain because they were good people. And there's other exes that if they passed, I'd be like, fuck that bitch. Because I didn't give a shit about them. So, depending on the ex, I might still have that feeling. And it doesn't mean that I'm not in love with whoever I'm currently dating, because I'm single right now. But it's got nothing to do with being in love or out of love with the person that I'm currently dating, whoever I'm currently dating. That just means that someone I cared about passed away. And I wouldn't feel bad if there was a girl I dated who, if there was a guy she really loved and he died and she was sad at the funeral, I wouldn't judge her for it. I'd be like, okay, what can I do to help you get past this? Sherri was well respected in the business and is considered a pioneer of women's wrestling. Also, Jared said that his mom and stepmom loved each other. And Pat said that Sherri told her she did a wonderful job raising her son. Jared said Sherri was my mother, but Pat was her tag team partner. Jared said wrestling was all her mother knew, and he doesn't hate her for it at all. And again, I gotta say it. Jared, to me, is a stand-up guy. That is a tremendous human being to not have hate in his heart for a woman who basically walked out on him. But I'll give credit where it's due. She eventually found a way to make it work. At first, she was gone, but eventually she was able to make sure financially he was taken care of. She did eventually bring him out on the road with her to hang out with wrestlers and celebrities. So Jared got to live a pretty cool life. He got to meet some really great people that a lot of us would have killed to meet. So he got to see his mom live a really cool life. And Pat, she did the heavy lifting. because she raised him. And Sherri was woman enough to look at Pat and say, hey, thank you for raising my son. Thank you for doing the day-to-day bullshit that I wasn't there to do. So the fact that she got along with the stepmom was tremendous. And that's the way it should be. That is the way it should be. If two people have a child together and they get divorced or split up, break up, whatever. Let's say you have a kid out of wedlock, but you break up, whatever. And there's a step parent in the picture, whether the woman gets remarried and there's a stepdad, or the guy gets remarried and there's a stepmom. Those groups of people should be able to get together and all co-parent. This girl that I dated a while back, she had a kid. I never met the real dad. But if she and I were still dating and we got really serious and I was becoming a stepdad to her kid, I made it clear to her I would never deny the biological father his rights to see his kid. Unless my girlfriend, or if she was my wife, unless she specifically told me, don't let this man near him. In which case, I gotta honor that. I tell him, look, this isn't my decision. I'm following what she's saying. Call her, talk to her, or go get court order or whatever, and then we'll talk about that. But I'm just doing my job. I'm trying to keep the peace. But I would coexist if I was dating a woman who had a kid and the dad was in the kid's life. I would coexist with that dad. I'd be like, hey, I'm not trying to take your spot. I'm just doing my part. They're helping to raise this kid, whether it be a boy or a girl, to help raise this kid. I'm just doing my part, okay? So let's you and me get on the same page. And I would do that. I would extend that olive branch. And if I got married or I had a kid out of wedlock or whatever, and I got divorced or broken up, and she got remarried to a guy, I would do the same. I'd be like, look, just let me see my kid with no drama, and you and I co-parent and coexist. That is the way it should be. So I like the fact that Sherri and Pat were able to do that. And again, Sherri is definitely a pioneer in women's wrestling. And again, this is somebody who, if you're a woman in the business, this is someone you owe a debt of gratitude to. It's Sensational Sherri. Because she's one of those women that paved the way for the women of today. For people like Rhea Ripley, Becky Lynch, Bayley, Mercedes Moné, Charlotte Flair, as much as I hate that bitch, Jade Cargill, Bianca Belair, all the top women you know of that are in the business today. Sensational Sherri was one of those foundations and should be treated as such. All right, and that, ladies and gentlemen, will wrap up this episode of Boochcast Reviews Darkside of the Ring. I thank you guys so much for tuning in. Tune in next week. We're going to have a crazy episode for you guys, and I'll be joined by an old friend, singer-songwriter, the one and only Desmond Dagenhart, and we'll be doing Enter Sandman, Legacy of a Hardcore Icon. That's right, we're going to be talking about the Sandman next week here on the Boochcast. So make sure you guys follow us on all of our podcast platforms. The link is down in the description box below. Make sure you follow us on all our social media platforms. The link is down in the description box below. And of course, you can support the Boochcast. Go to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/the Boochcast/support. That link is down in the description box below. And of course, as always, hit the subscribe button and ring that bell to be notified so you never miss another episode of Boochcast Reviews Darkside of the Ring, as well as other additional Boochcast YouTube content. We'll talk to you guys next time. Until then, pizza, baby!